Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, welcome to my video. Let me introduce myself. My name is Febrian Dwi Aji Pangestu. Study number 20612111034, English Education Department. And today in my videos, I will present or explain about 5 assessing. The first is assessing listening, and number 2 is assessing reading, and number 3 is assessing speaking, number 4 is assessing grammar, and the last is assessing writing. Okay, and the first material we will about assessing listening. Okay, the first material is assessing listening. Nah, di dalam assessing listening tersebut ini terdapat 5 types of listening. The first is intensive, number 2 is responsive, number 3 is selective, and the last is extensive. And number 1 is intensive. Terdapat beberapa contoh dari intensif tersebut. Kita juga sudah sering mendengarnya atau melihatnya, atau sudah sering menjelaskan materinya. Yang pertama adalah contohnya adalah phonemes, and number 2 is words and intonation, and number 2 is responsive. Example of responsive is a greetings and comment or question, and number 3 is selective. Example atau contoh dari selective tersebut adalah television or TV, number 2 is radio news items and stories, and the last is extensive. Example of extensive is listening for the gist, the main idea, making inference. And the next is micro and macro skills of listening. The first is micro skills. The micro skills of listening is attending to the smaller bits and chunks of language in more of button-up process. And number 2 is macro skills of listening. The macro skills of listening focusing on the larger elements involved in a top-down approach. And the second material atau materi yang kedua adalah assessing reading. Nah, di assessing reading ini juga terdapat tipe atau types atau genres of reading. Yang pertama adalah, atau the first is general interest articles, number 2 is technical reports, number 3 is textbooks, and number 4 is essay, number 5 is text direction, and the last is editorials and opinion writing. Oke, kita akan mengulik dari genres of reading tersebut. Yang pertama adalah general interest articles. Kalian mungkin bertanya-tanya, apa sih contoh dari general interest article? Oke, saya akan menjelaskan bahwa contoh dari general interest article adalah magazines dan newspapers. Nah, atau majalah atau koran. And number 2 is technical reports. Nah, contoh dari technical reports ini adalah laboratorium reports and professional journal articles. And number 3 is textbooks. Nah, contoh dari textbooks tersebut adalah tesis, atau yang bisa kita kenal adalah sebelum kita memulai skripsi, kalau nggak salah ya. And number 4 is essay. Contoh dari essay tersebut adalah papers. And number 5 is text directions. And the last is editorial and opinion writing. And the next is micro and macro skills for reading. Nah, di sini juga akan saya jelaskan beberapa micro dan macro skills for reading. Mungkin ada banyak, tapi akan saya jelaskan beberapa saja untuk agar supaya kalian bisa memahami micro dan macro skill untuk reading ini. And the first is micro skills. The first is discriminate among the distinctive grammarless and orthographic pattern of English. And number 2 is retain chunks of language of different lengths in short-term memory. And number 3 is process writing at an efficient rate of speed to suit the purpose. And next is recognize a core of words and interpret word order, pattern, and their significance. And next is recognize grammatical word classes atau noun atau verbs and systems or tenses, agreement, pluralization, patterns, rules, and elliptical forms. And next is recognize that a particular meaning may be expressed in different grammatical forms. And the last is recognize cohesive device in written discourse and their role in signaling the relationship between and among clause. And the next is macro skills. And ini juga ada beberapa macro skill dari reading tersebut. And the first is recognize the rhetorical forms of written discourse and their significance for interpretation. And number two is recognize the communicative functions of writing text according to the form and purpose. And number three is infer context that is not explicit by using background knowledge. And the next is distinguish between literal and implied meaning. And next is detect culturally specific reference and interpret them in a context of the appropriate cultural schemata. And the last is develop and use a battery of reading strategies such as scanning and skimming, detecting discourse markers. And the next material is assessing grammar. In terms of assessment, grammar is central to language description and test taker performance. Grammatical knowledge consists of three elements. The first is grammatical forms of the structures of a language. Form is about morphology of how words are formed and syntax, how words are strung together. Both of them are concerned with the linguistic accuracy of language. And number two is the grammatical meaning of those forms. Grammatical meaning consists of both the literal and intended message that is conveyed by the form, in concern with the meaningfulness of the language used. And number three is their pragmatic meaning are used in a given context. The pragmatic or implied meaning result from the appropriate language choice a learner makes in a given communicative event. And the next material is assessing speaking. Nah, di sini juga di assessing speaking juga terdapat types or tipe atau genres of speaking. Mungkin dari tipe speaking ini juga ada yang hampir sama dengan assessing listening. Mari kita simak. The first is imitative, number two is intensive, and number three is responsive, and number four is interactive, and the last is extensive. Okay, the first is imitative. Performance is the ability to simply parrot back or imitative a word or phrase or possibility a sentence. The only role of listening here is in the short-term storage of the prompt, just long enough to allow the speaker to retain the short stretch of language that must be imitated. And number two is intensive. It employed in assessment context is the production of the short stretch of oral language designed to demonstrate competence in a narrow band of grammatical, phrasal, lexical, or phonological relationships. The speaker must be aware of semantic properties to be able to respond, but interaction with an interlocutor or test administrator is minimal at best. And number three is responsive. Responsive, it includes interaction and test comprehensions, but at the somewhat limited level or very short conversations, standard greeting and small talk, simple requests and comments, and the like. And number 4 is interactive. The difference between responsive and interactive speaking is in the length and complexity of the interactions, which sometimes includes multiple exchanges and or multiple participants. And the last is extensive. Extensive oral production thus includes speeches, oral, oral presentations, and storytelling, during which the opportunity for oral interactions from listener is either highly limited or ruled out together. Okay, the next is micro and macro of speaking. Micro skills of speaking is referred to producing the smaller chunks of language such as phonemes, morphemes, words, collocations, and phrasal units. And the next is macro skills. The macro skills of speaking is the speakers focus on the larger elements: fluency, discourse, functions, style, cohesion, nonverbal communication, and strategic options. And the next material is assessing writing. Nah, di assessing writing ini juga terdapat genres atau types or tipe dari written language. The first is academic writing, number 2 is job related writing, and number 3 is personal writing. Nah, dari ketiga genre of written language tersebut juga ada beberapa contoh. Yang pertama adalah academic writing. Contohnya adalah paper and general subject reports, essay, composition, academically focused journal, short answer, test response, technical reports, thesis, and dissertation. And number 2 is, atau yang nomor 2 adalah job related writing. Contohnya adalah message atau pesan, letter or emails, memos, reports, schedules, advertisements, announcements, and manuals. And number 3 is personal writing. For example, letters, emails, greeting cards, invitations, message, notes, diaries, calendar entries, etc. And next is micro and macro skills for writing. The first is micro skills. Number 1 is produce grammars and orthographic pattern of English. And number 2 is produce writing at an efficient rate of speed to suit the purpose. And number 3 is produce an acceptable grammatical system. And number 4 is express our particular meaning in different grammatical forms. And the last is use cohesive device in written discourse. And next is macro skills. And the macro skill is use the rhetorical forms and conversation of written discourse. And number 2 is appropriately accomplish the communicative functions of written text according to the form and purpose. And number 3 is conveying and connection between the events and communication, such relations, main idea, supporting idea, new information, given information, generalizations, and exemplification. And next is distinguish between literal and implied meaning when writing. And the last is correctly convey culturally specific reference in the context of the written text. Okay, I think it's enough for the videos. Thank you so much for watching, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.